Justice Gorsuch?
I think the argument we've kind of heard from the other side involves, okay, if there is a realization requirement, it's met here because the corporation realized the income. And then it just becomes a question of attribution of that realized income, and Congress has a free hand there, and the 16th Amendment says nothing. Your response?
My response is that the court has always looked at questions of income from the point of view of the shareholder. If you point to a 16th Amendment case or a case involving gross income under the tax code, the court has always looked at the individual circumstances of the shareholder to ascertain whether or not that shareholder has actually realized a gain. And so, for example, Indianapolis Power and Light, a 1990 case, the court looked specifically at the facts regarding certain types of customer security deposits. It didn't look at it as some sort of abstract inquiry where things might be assigned and so forth. It sought to address the question as to whether or not that shareholder had income. McComber did exactly the same thing with respect to shareholders of corporations. I think the court would certainly have to reverse McComber, which the government has not asked it to do, to get beyond the idea that just some free-floating notion of income is sufficient for the government to point at something and tax it to a particular individual as their income.
You're saying, if I can put a fine point on it, if I understand it, the question is whether it's income to the taxpayer who's being taxed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. And then I'd like you to go back to the discussion you had with Justice Jackson, and I understand your point that the excise argument has been forfeited or perhaps even waived in this case. Just want your thoughts on it generally, as an original matter. We have the Hilton case from quite a long time ago. Carriages were thought perhaps not to be a direct tax. Could the government, as an original matter, call this an excise tax?
I think the answer resoundingly would be no. The whole point of the direct tax clauses was to make it difficult for Congress to levy these types of taxes while still leaving that authority available in times of emergency. And so far as taxes on personal property and things like investments were concerned, that was addressed extensively during the ratification debates for the Constitution. And it was really one of the primary arguments of the anti-federalists against ratification of the Constitution was that permitting Congress to levy direct taxes would simply be a step too far and would allow Congress to destroy the states and reach all the property that was known to all families across the country. So, that was one of the foremost concerns, and the way that the framers addressed that was to render these types of taxes specifically subject to apportionment. This was addressed and discussed at the Connecticut, the Pennsylvania, and the Virginia ratifying convention by James Madison, by Chief Justice Marshall. It was a central concern at the time, and as a matter of original meaning, this sort of investment, this sort of property, is something that necessarily was taxes on it was subject to apportionment.
Sorry, one last question. Returning to my first one, apologies to shift you about. If the court were to hold that the only realization requirement is some realization somewhere along the chain by a corporation antecedent to the taxpayer, what would be the consequences of a holding like that?
The consequences would be to open the door to taxation of practically everything. All property that a person owns is the fruit of income at some point in time, whether it might be income that they've received long in the past. Ultimately, all property that we have is made up of flows of income that have then been invested. And so if all that was necessary was some level of income, then Congress could simply point at anything and say, well, at some point this was income to some person at some level, and therefore can be subject to taxation without apportionment.
I suppose we could, and maybe would have to draw lines as to how far back in time one can go in assessing that chain of realization.
That's right, and I don't really understand how the court would do that based on the constitutional text. The government's definition of income is simply the increase in a person's wealth between 2 points in time. Well, if the time is set at a person's birth or many decades in the past, that could reach some or potentially all of their property, and I don't really understand what the limiting principle would be.
Thank you.